No one in Coldwater County could ever remember a storm quite like that one, when the clouds pressed low and the wind howled down the valley, rattling the old tin roof of the county livestock auction. Thunder cracked, the kind that made the ground tremble beneath your boots, and sheets of rain turned the dirt lot outside into a sea of brown water. Inside, the air was thick with the musk of wet animals, diesel, and fried food, the crowd restless and impatient for the night to end. Grace Harper hadn't planned on coming. She was the last person anyone expected to see at the Saturday night auction, let alone by herself. 37, a quiet woman with tired eyes and a ponytail damp from the rain, Grace had spent most of the last 3 years avoiding the places she used to love. She moved through the world like someone living underwater, her voice soft, her presence a shadow. The old Grace, the one who'd laughed at this very auction, bidding on farm tools and pumpkin pies with her husband and daughter, was gone. But something had pushed her out of her house that night. She barely remembered driving there, only the relentless tapping of rain on the windshield and the ache in her chest. Maybe she was running away from the silence that pressed in on her after dark. Or maybe, just maybe, she was looking for a sign. Anything to prove she hadn't disappeared completely. The auction ring was chaos. Men shouting, boots stomping. The auctioneer's voice a wild river of numbers and names. Cattle and goats went first, but the horses were always last, their fates often the worst. The rain drummed louder, and Grace lingered near the back, clutching her purse with white knuckles, just another face in the crowd. That's when they brought him in. He looked nothing like the sleek show horses in the magazines, or the glossy quarter horses that went for thousands at state fairs. This one limped. Mud and blood caked his legs. His coat was dull and mottled with scars, a raw patch running down his left shoulder. Even in the noisy ring, you could see the whites of his eyes. Some men laughed, others looked away, and the auctioneer barely bothered to call out a starting bid. Everyone knew where this horse was headed. The kill buyer sat in the front row, raincoat slick and hat low, already making room on his trailer. Grace couldn't look away. Something about the horse, the way he stood trembling but proud, refusing to meet anyone's eyes, made her heart clench. It was stupid, she told herself, reckless. But suddenly she was 10 years old again, holding her daughter's hand at the county fair, listening to impossible stories about wild horses and magic and second chances. "Let's move it along," the auctioneer barked, impatient as the horse circled anxiously. A bolt of lightning split the sky outside. The lights flickered, and in that instant, Grace thought she saw something familiar in the animal's haunted expression. Her pulse hammered. She tried to step back, but her feet wouldn't move. "Do I hear 200? The auctioneer tried. Silence. 100? 50? Someone in the back jeered. "Put him out of his misery!" There were scattered laughs. The kill buyer raised his hand, bored. 30. Grace's throat closed. She had no idea what she was doing. Her mind screamed for her to stop. But her arm shot up before she could think. 50! The word echoed in the stunned silence, her voice shaking. All eyes snapped to her. Some grinned, others muttered. The auctioneer, surprised, called for any more bids. The kill buyer just shrugged. He didn't care enough to argue. "Sold." The gavel came down hard. "To the lady in the back." Grace barely heard him. Her knees threatened to buckle. The crowd parted, a mix of disbelief and amusement, as she made her way to the office, hands trembling as she filled out the paperwork. Outside, the rain had eased, but thunder still rumbled in the distance. The old barn manager found her by the pens. "You sure you want this one, miss?" "He's trouble, been passed around. Nobody keeps him long." Grace swallowed. "What's his name?" The manager checked his list. "Whisper, but folks just call him the Ghost. He doesn't trust anyone." She looked at the horse, now alone in the pen. Whisper's head hung low, but his ears flicked as she approached. For a second, she saw something, a flicker of hope, or maybe just a trick of the light. She reached out, palm up, her voice a whisper in the dark. "It's okay," she breathed. "You're safe now." Whisper didn't move. The storm faded to a dull roar. In that moment, Grace felt the strangest thing. A spark, small but real, kindling deep in the ashes of her heart. The drive home was slow. Whisper loaded with surprising calm, but the roads were slick, and Grace's old truck rattled with every bump. She kept glancing back, expecting the horse to panic, to bolt, but he only stood there, silent, staring into the rain. As they reached her property, an aging farmhouse wrapped in honeysuckle and memories, Grace felt the weight of what she'd done. Had she rescued the horse? Or had he rescued her? She led Whisper to the old barn at the edge of the field. The space had sat empty for years, dust and sorrow thick on every beam. Grace fumbled with the latch, heart pounding, and guided him inside. Whisper hesitated, then stepped over the threshold, shaking off the storm. Lightning flashed one last time, illuminating them both. A broken woman and a broken horse. Alone, but not defeated. Grace slumped against the stall door, breath shuddering out. Whisper watched her, unmoving. The rain began again, softer now, and for the first time in years, Grace didn't feel completely alone. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring. But tonight, in the heart of the storm, two lost souls had found each other. And somehow, that was enough. That night, the storm finally broke. But the world outside Grace's farmhouse stayed restless. Wind creaked through the trees, scattering leaves against the porch steps. Inside, every shadow seemed longer than usual. Every sound a little too sharp. Grace sat on the edge of her narrow bed, still damp from the rain, her boots caked with mud she hadn't bothered to wipe away. Down in the barn, she could hear Whisper shifting in his stall, a restless pacing, hooves thudding dully against wood. Sleep was impossible. Whenever she closed her eyes, she saw the horse's haunted stare, the raw scar down his shoulder, the way he'd frozen beneath her hand, as if waiting for something he didn't believe would come. Over and over, her mind circled back to the same impossible thought. He looks just like Ellie's imaginary horse. Grace had almost forgotten about that old story, one her daughter told on rainy nights just like this. Ellie had drawn that horse everywhere, on school papers, in the dust on the windows, in the margins of church bulletins. She always said his name was Whisper, that he was gentle but sad, with a big scar on his side from fighting off nightmares. Grace remembered laughing at that, brushing Ellie's curls from her forehead, promising one day they'd find a horse that brave. Now, as she stared at the rain-streaked window, that memory felt like a bruise she couldn't hide. Sometime after midnight, Grace padded down the stairs and out to the barn, lantern in hand. The air inside smelled of old hay and wet earth. Whisper stood at the back of the stall, his sides heaving. He tensed as Grace approached, but didn't bolt. She set the lantern down and crouched just outside the stall, watching him. "You look just like him, you know," she whispered. Her voice was steadier than she expected. The horse my little girl dreamed about, with that same scar. Whisper flicked his ears, turning his head as if listening. For a wild moment, Grace felt sure he understood her. Thunder rumbled far away, fading to silence. Grace rested her forehead on the stall rail. Tears burned behind her eyes, but she held them back. "Why did I do this?" she breathed. "What am I hoping for?" Suddenly, the barn door swung open with a bang. Grace started, wiping her face as her younger sister, Ella, stormed in. Ella was 5 years younger, fierce and practical, with the same blue eyes as Grace but none of her softness. "Are you crazy?" Ella hissed, her voice tense, almost panicked. "You bought a half-dead horse, Grace? In this storm? What are you thinking?" Grace looked up at her sister, exhaustion plain on her face. "I couldn't leave him," she said quietly. "It felt like I was meant to save him." Ella shook her head, pacing the barn aisle. "Meant to? Grace, you can't just keep bringing home things to fix. First the stray dogs, now this horse. It's not going to bring them back. It's just going to hurt you more." A long silence stretched between them. Grace wanted to shout, to tell Ella how the emptiness had gnawed at her for years, how she'd barely made it through the days teaching other people's children, how she'd hidden her grief in 100 small rituals that never seemed to work. But she only managed, "It's not about fixing. It's about not giving up." Ella's shoulders slumped. "I know you're hurting, Grace, but sometimes I worry you're never coming back to us. To me." Grace swallowed, pain tightening her chest. "I don't know if I can," she admitted. "But tonight, when I saw him, there was something, like a sign, like maybe I'm allowed a second chance." Ella stepped closer, her expression softening. "Or maybe it's just another way to stay lost," she murmured. "You don't have to do this alone. You know that, right?" Grace nodded, unable to speak. Whisper shuffled in his stall, tossing his head, his big dark eyes locking on hers for just a heartbeat. Grace let out a slow breath. "I think he needs me," she whispered. "And I need him too." Ella shook her head, but she didn't argue. "I'll help you clean him up in the morning," she said, voice gentler. "But if you're bringing him home, you're going to have to face everything else you've been running from." For a moment, the only sound was the steady rhythm of Whisper's breathing and the distant whisper of wind. Grace felt something shift inside her, an old, stubborn piece of sorrow loosening its grip. Later, Grace sat alone in the kitchen, a mug of cold coffee cradled in her hands. The house was filled with ghosts. Photos of Ellie, dusty trophies from rodeo nights, her husband's battered boots by the back door. She stared at the mug, trying to imagine what Ellie would say if she were here. Would she laugh, scold? Or would she be proud her mother had finally dared to do something wild again? Outside, the sky began to lighten, turning from black to bruised blue. Grace slipped on her boots and walked to the barn again. This time, when she reached Whisper's stall, the horse stepped closer, sniffing her outstretched hand. She stood perfectly still, heart pounding, as he nudged her palm with his velvet nose. Grace smiled, a small, trembling thing. "Good morning, Whisper," she said softly. "We both survived the night, didn't we?" As the sun rose, burning away the last of the storm, Grace made a silent promise. Whatever came next, she would face it. For Whisper, for herself. Maybe, just maybe, for Ellie too. And for the first time in years, hope felt possible. Fragile, trembling, but alive. Morning came softly, sunlight creeping in pale stripes across the kitchen floor, promising a fresh start even as the air remained heavy with the scent of last night's rain. Grace poured coffee with hands that trembled less than usual, her mind already halfway to the barn. She barely touched her toast, listening instead for any sound from outside, the call of a morning dove, the distant engine of a neighbor's truck, the hopeful nicker of a horse she hardly knew but already couldn't let go of. She found Whisper exactly where she'd left him, standing quietly in his stall, ears twitching as she approached. He looked rougher in the honest light of morning, patches of missing hair, ribs outlined beneath his dull coat, a raw, crusted wound slashing his left shoulder. Grace's heart clenched at the sight. She knew she'd have to be careful. Horses in this kind of shape could turn mean or simply fade away. But there was something in his eyes, not just fear or pain, but a kind of battered dignity, a stubborn refusal to give in. She respected that. Ella showed up just after sunrise, her boots still muddy from the night before, her hair pulled back in a messy braid. She didn't say much, just handed Grace a fresh bucket of warm water and a battered old brush. Together they set to work, Grace talking in soft, steady tones, Ella mostly silent but efficient, her hands gentle despite her gruffness. Cleaning Whisper's wounds took patience. Grace knelt in the straw, whispering nonsense while she dabbed iodine onto the worst of the cuts. Whisper flinched but didn't kick, watching her with wide, wary eyes. Ella held a halter loosely in place, murmuring reassurances when the horse snorted or tossed his head. The three of them moved slowly, an awkward dance of trust and uncertainty. When it was over, Grace stood back, wiping sweat and tears from her face, her legs aching from crouching so long. "He let you touch him," Ella remarked, almost surprised. Grace nodded. "He's braver than he looks." Ella smirked. "So are you, sometimes." They spent the rest of the morning fixing up the old barn, patching leaky boards, spreading fresh straw, scrubbing water buckets. Whisper watched them from his stall, sometimes stepping forward to peer curiously at their work, other times retreating to the far corner, lost in his own memories. Grace caught herself talking to him more than she'd expected, narrating every chore in a gentle, sing-song voice. It wasn't just for the horse. It was for herself, too. A way to fill the silence that so often threatened to swallow her whole. As the days slipped by, a routine began to settle. Grace rose early to check on Whisper, offering him carrots and hand-mixed feed. She brushed his coat in slow, careful strokes, untangling burrs and dried mud, sometimes humming songs she used to sing to Ellie. The simple acts of care became a ritual, an anchor in the stormy sea of her grief. At first, Whisper wouldn't let her near his head, shying away from any quick movement. But each day, he came a little closer, accepted her touch a little more. One evening, as the sun slipped behind the hills, he stood quietly while she pressed her cheek against his neck, feeling the thunder of his heartbeat, strong and alive. Grace closed her eyes and breathed him in. Earth, sweat, hope. She started spending more time in the barn, using the excuse of chores to avoid the quiet, haunted rooms of the house. But Ella noticed the change. One afternoon, she found Grace kneeling in the straw, stroking Whisper's mane while lost in thought. "You ever going to talk about her?" Ella asked gently, lowering herself onto a bale of hay. "Ellie, I mean." Grace froze. For a long moment, she couldn't answer. The barn filled with the steady sound of Whisper chewing hay, the distant drone of cicadas. "I'm afraid if I talk about her, I'll break," Grace finally admitted, her voice thin and shaking. Like if I say her name out loud, the grief will drown me all over again. Ella nodded, her eyes soft. But maybe if you never say her name, she'll disappear. And I don't think that's what you want. Not really. Grace let the words hang between them, feeling their truth like a stone in her pocket. Whisper shifted, bumping his head gently against her shoulder. She smiled, tears pricking her eyes. I used to tell her stories every night, Grace said quietly, her voice steadier. About brave horses and wild adventures. She always wanted me to promise we'd find our own Whisper someday. Ella looked away, swallowing hard. I remember. She made me promise too. They sat together in silence, broken only by the barn's quiet noises and the occasional soft sigh of the horse beside them. For the first time in years, Grace felt a little lighter. The burden of her grief shared and, just for a moment, less crushing. That night, after Ella had gone, Grace returned to the barn one last time. She found Whisper dozing in the straw, his sides rising and falling with each breath. She crouched beside him, tracing her fingers lightly along his scar, humming a lullaby she'd almost forgotten. The darkness no longer seemed so threatening. As the moon rose, spilling silver across the fields, Grace whispered a promise into the quiet barn. I'm here, Whisper. I'm not leaving you. In the days that followed, the barn became a sanctuary. Grace and Whisper healed together, their wounds less visible but just as real. And in the shelter of silence, hope took root, a fragile, stubborn seed determined to grow. Early autumn sun spilled gold over the valley, touching every fence post and wildflower with a gentle light. The barn, so long a place of dust and neglect, now felt alive with small signs of renewal. Fresh straw, clean buckets, the steady sound of Whisper's breath as he watched the world beyond his stall. Grace felt herself changing with the barn, moving with a steadiness she hadn't known in years. Each day began and ended with the horse, chores and quiet moments of trust becoming the rhythm that steadied her heart. One Saturday morning, Grace decided to do something she'd avoided for years: clean out the old storage loft above the tack room. Dust danced in the sunbeams as she pulled boxes into the light, sorting through faded blankets, broken bridles, boots Ellie had outgrown years before. The task was bittersweet. Every item held a memory, sometimes so sharp she had to stop and breathe. She almost gave up, but something kept her searching, digging deeper into the clutter and the pain. At the bottom of an old chest, tucked between a box of rodeo ribbons and a stack of school notebooks, she found a worn folder with Ellie's handwriting on the cover. Horse Stories for Mama was scrawled in bright pink marker, the heart-shaped O a childish signature. Grace sat on the floor, the barn quiet around her, and flipped through page after page of drawings. Wild horses racing across crayon meadows, ponies with sparkling manes, and, on the very last sheet, a single horse drawn in careful pencil. She froze. The horse in Ellie's drawing wasn't perfect. He was thin, his coat shaded dark with pencil, but a jagged line ran down his left shoulder. Beneath the picture, Ellie had written, "Whisper, he's brave because he's hurt. But he always comes back home." Grace's hand shook as she traced the scar on the page, identical to the one that marked the real Whisper's shoulder. A chill ran through her, a strange mixture of awe and sorrow. Had Ellie somehow known? Or was this just another cruel trick of fate? A coincidence that meant nothing? The urge to believe it was a sign pressed so hard against Grace's chest that her breath caught. She stood and carried the folder down to Whisper's stall, kneeling beside the horse as he nuzzled her shoulder, sensing her unrest. "Look, boy," she whispered, opening the page for him to see. "She dreamed you before she ever met you." The barn door creaked, and Ella stepped in, arms full of supplies. She paused when she saw Grace on the ground, tears running down her cheeks. "You okay?" Ella asked, kneeling beside her. Grace handed over the drawing, unable to trust her voice. Ella studied the page, then looked at Whisper, her eyes wide with realization. "I remember this," Ella said softly. "Ellie showed it to me, said he was her hero." Grace nodded, swiping at her tears. "It's like she sent him to us, like we're supposed to fix what's broken." Ella leaned back against the stall, silent for a long time. Or maybe she just wanted us to remember we're still family, even after everything. They sat together, letting the quiet do its work. Whisper, emboldened by the gentle mood, nudged both women, lowering his head for a scratch. Grace laughed, a soft, surprised sound. "He's getting braver every day." Ella smiled. "So are you." For the rest of the morning, the sisters worked side by side, clearing old clutter and sharing memories. They found Ellie's old saddle, too small for either of them, but perfectly preserved, and Grace gently dusted it off, setting it on a low rail as a quiet tribute. They talked about childhood summers, long trail rides, lemonade on the porch, the way their father used to sing off-key as he mucked stalls. The memories hurt, but for the first time in years, they didn't feel like wounds. They felt like gifts. That afternoon, as the sun dipped low, Grace took Whisper into the pasture for a walk. The horse moved slowly but with more confidence, pausing often to graze or sniff the air. Grace led him along the old fence line, her thoughts drifting between past and present. Sometimes she imagined Ellie beside her, barefoot, hair flying, chattering about horses and stars and dreams that never died. Sometimes she let herself believe that Whisper was more than just a horse. He was a bridge, a living link to everything she'd lost and everything she still hoped for. Night settled gently over the farm, and Grace brought Whisper back to the barn. She stayed with him until the stars blinked on, humming lullabies she hadn't sung in years. Whisper listened, eyes half closed, calm as a summer evening. For the first time, he seemed to accept her presence, pressing his nose to her palm before settling into the straw. Back in the house, Grace placed Ellie's drawing on the mantel. The sight of it, a scarred horse, brave and determined, filled her with a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. Before bed, she called Ella, her voice steady. "Thank you. For today." Ella's reply was warm, tired, full of something like hope. "We're going to be okay, Grace. I really think we are." Grace hung up, letting the silence fill the room. She looked around, at the old trophies, the faded photos, the drawing on the mantel, and realized that maybe, just maybe, healing wasn't about forgetting. It was about finding new ways to remember. And as she drifted off to sleep, Grace knew she wasn't alone. Whisper was in the barn, Ella was just a call away, and Ellie's love was stitched through every memory, every hope for tomorrow. The days shortened, and the Tennessee mornings came cool and misty. The fields outside Grace's kitchen window were streaked with gold and silver, and every day, Whisper's coat grew glossier, his eyes a little brighter. Grace found herself walking lighter, talking more, and feeling less like a ghost in her own life. But even as routines grew comfortable, a gnawing question settled in her chest. Why did this horse feel so familiar? Why did he trust her so deeply, so quickly? One evening, as she brushed Whisper in the soft barn light, Grace ran her hand along the old scar on his shoulder. It wasn't just the drawing or her daughter's stories. It was the way he watched her, always waiting for her to speak first, as if expecting her to know some secret password. The memory tugged at her, always just out of reach. Ella dropped by that night, bringing a sack of feed and an envelope thick with printouts. "I did some digging," she announced, sliding the papers across the tack room table. "Auction records, old sale listings. Thought maybe you'd want to know where he's been." Grace's fingers shook as she flipped through the documents. There were faded copies of bills of sale, transport manifests, even some notes scribbled in unfamiliar hands. Whisper, it seemed, had changed owners at least 5 times in the last 3 years. His name sometimes altered, sometimes just Bay Gelding damaged. The dates jumped out at Grace. There was a gap, right around the time her own world had shattered. "He's been all over," Ella murmured, pointing to a list. "But look at this. Here 3 years ago. Sold at the estate dispersal in Oak Hollow. That's your old address." Grace's heart skipped. "That's when we lost everything. When I couldn't stay." She remembered the whirlwind of grief, the auction to pay off debts, the hurried way they'd parted with anything not nailed down. She'd barely remembered the horses, lost in a fog of funeral arrangements and numbness. Her voice trembled. "You don't think—" Ella's voice softened. "I think Whisper was your horse, Grace. Or at least your family's. Maybe Ellie's, in a way." It felt impossible, but suddenly everything made sense. The scar, the way he recognized her, the uncanny trust. Grace stared at Whisper, now calm and drowsy after his grooming, and saw not just a rescued animal, but a survivor of her family's tragedy. A witness. "Why would he end up here?" she asked, tears burning her eyes. "How could he find his way back?" Ella hesitated. "Some horses, they just know. I read stories about them breaking out, walking for miles, slipping through fences. Maybe he ran. Maybe he kept coming back, and someone got tired of chasing him. Maybe he wanted to come home." A lump formed in Grace's throat. The idea that Whisper had been searching for her all this time, escaping auction yards, slipping from careless owners, braving highways and storms, felt almost too much to believe. But she wanted to believe it. She needed to. Determined to learn more, Grace and Ella spent the next few days tracking down the names from the papers. They called old numbers, visited nearby farms, and listened to half-remembered tales from stable hands and auctioneers. Most didn't remember Whisper specifically, but a few offered hints. A skittish bay gelding who'd broken fences, always trying to bolt. A horse who refused to settle as if searching for someone. One woman, an older rancher with a kind voice, recalled him vividly. He wasn't mean, just sad. Wouldn't eat for days unless a little girl came by. When she visited, he perked up. After she stopped coming, he just faded. Grace pressed for details, her hands clenching. What did the girl look like? The woman hesitated, then described a child with curly hair, a gap-toothed smile. Ellie, Grace realized, tears stinging her eyes. She remembered that desperate summer, bringing Ellie for one last goodbye before they left the farm for good. Whisper had nuzzled her daughter, following her as far as the lead would let him go. The puzzle pieces fell into place. Whisper hadn't just been abandoned. He'd been trying to get home. Maybe every escape, every stubborn refusal to settle was a journey back to the place he remembered. Her touch, Ellie's laughter, the comfort of the barn that now held them both. That night, Grace sat in the barn long after Ella left. She told Whisper the whole story, her voice breaking and steady in turns. "You never gave up, did you? You kept looking for us, even when we were lost ourselves." Whisper listened, head bowed, eyes gentle and deep. He nudged her shoulder as if to say, "I found you. I'm home." As the moon rose, Grace leaned against the stall, the ache in her chest slowly giving way to gratitude. She realized that loving meant not only remembering the past, but also forgiving herself for everything she couldn't save. She'd spent so long haunted by guilt, unable to let go. But Whisper's loyalty, his impossible, stubborn hope, reminded her that redemption wasn't about erasing what hurt, but embracing what remained. And for the first time, Grace let herself believe in the possibility of new beginnings. The wind shifted, carrying the first bite of winter through the valley and settling a hush over the farm. Grace moved through her days with new purpose. Each morning, beginning with Whisper, his eyes brighter, his steps surer, as if the threads of their past were finally weaving into something whole. But as much as she tried to live in the present, memory clung to her. Bittersweet, inescapable, a shadow in every corner of the old farmhouse. One gray afternoon, a knock came at the door. Grace opened it to find Mr. Ward, the postman, awkward and wind-chilled. He handed her a small bundle of mail, mostly junk. But nestled in the pile was an envelope yellowed with age, the handwriting achingly familiar. Grace's heart skipped. It was Thomas's handwriting, her late husband, gone these 3 years. She stared at the return address, recognizing the bold block letters, the little swirl on the H he always made in Harper. Her hands shook as she turned the envelope over. The date on the postmark was smudged, but the year was clear. Mailed months before the accident, never delivered. She carried the letter to the kitchen, staring at it as if it might vanish. She made coffee, her hands moving automatically, her mind somewhere else. The letter sat beside her cup, waiting. Finally, unable to stand the tension, she slid a knife beneath the flap. Inside was a single page, written on lined paper from Thomas's desk. His words were rushed, almost breathless, the kind of writing he did when an idea hit him in the middle of the night. She pressed the paper flat and read, "Grace, if you ever find Whisper again, if by some wild luck he makes his way back, don't let him go. He's more than a horse, you know that. He's part of us. Ellie loves him, and so do I, even when I'm gruff about the feed bills. If there comes a day when it's just you and him, keep the promise. Bring hope home. Love you. Always, Tom." Grace's vision blurred, the room closing in around her. She pressed the letter to her chest, sobbing, deep, wrenching sobs that wrung the grief out of her bones, leaving her empty and trembling. For years she'd carried the guilt of that terrible season. The loss, the debts, the night she watched everything slip away. She'd told herself it was fate, but some small voice had always whispered that it was her fault, that she'd failed the ones she loved most. Now, in Thomas's words, she felt forgiveness, an echo from beyond, urging her to release the weight she'd carried for so long. Later, Grace wandered out to the barn, the letter folded tightly in her pocket. Whisper greeted her with a nicker, head over the stall door. Grace stroked his nose, her touch lighter than ever. "He wanted me to keep the promise," she said softly. "I didn't even know I'd made one." She sat with Whisper in the straw, reading the letter aloud. As her voice drifted through the barn, she felt Thomas beside her. The warmth of his hand, the deep rumble of his laugh, the certainty in his love. Whisper stood perfectly still, listening, as if he too could sense something beyond the veil of the ordinary. Night fell, cold and absolute, but Grace stayed with Whisper, watching the stars burn through the darkness. The letter felt like a key, unlocking doors she'd barred for years. She realized that hope didn't mean forgetting the past or denying her sorrow. Hope was what kept you moving, even when you couldn't see the end of the road. Over the next days, Grace embraced her new role as Whisper's savior. She repaired fences, cleared old brush, mended tack, work that was hard and grounding, filling her with a sense of accomplishment she'd nearly forgotten. She opened the barn doors wider, letting in sunlight and fresh air, inviting the world back into her life. Ella noticed the change. "You look taller," she teased one morning, watching Grace shovel hay. "Like you finally took off a 100-pound coat." Grace laughed, a rich, unguarded sound. "Maybe I did. Or maybe I'm just standing on hope for once." Ella grinned, but her eyes were soft. "You're different, Grace. Stronger. I'm glad." Together they began planning for winter, stockpiling supplies and checking the roof for leaks. Grace felt the cold less sharply now, as if the fire inside her burned warmer than the season. She even invited a few neighbors over, old friends who had drifted away after the tragedy, unsure of what to say or how to help. They came, bringing pie and stories, lingering longer each time. One afternoon, as the sky turned lavender and gold, Grace found herself leading Whisper out into the yard for a walk. Children from a nearby house watched from the fence, wide-eyed and shy. Whisper lifted his head, ears pricked, as if remembering a time when the world was full of laughter and light. Grace waved the children over, kneeling to their level. "His name is Whisper," she told them, voice gentle. "He's had a hard journey, but he's safe now." One little girl reached out, her fingers trembling as they brushed Whisper's nose. The horse stood still, patient and kind. Grace watched, tears prickling her eyes, as the children giggled and stroked his neck. She realized, with a quiet certainty, that bringing hope home wasn't just about Whisper, or even herself. It was about sharing that hope, letting it grow, offering it to anyone who needed a little light. That night, as she tucked the letter from Thomas into her bedside drawer, Grace felt something she hadn't felt in years, a sense of peace. She had kept the promise. She was home. Winter arrived in a single night, a sudden plunge from crisp autumn chill to biting cold. Frost glazed the barn roof, turning the pasture into a field of crystal blades. The cold felt deeper, sharper, more personal than any in recent memory. Grace watched her breath curl in the air as she hurried to the barn before sunrise, anxious to check on Whisper. The horse had been sluggish the night before, his eyes a little dull, his step heavy. Now, as she slid open the barn door, a wave of icy air swept past her, carrying the scent of damp straw and fear. Whisper stood in the corner of his stall, sides heaving, head drooped. He barely lifted his eyes when Grace approached. Her heart dropped. She pressed a hand to his neck and felt his skin burning hot beneath the winter coat. Panic prickled along her spine. "No, no, not now," she breathed. Whisper shuddered, nostrils flaring with each labored breath. Grace ran through her mental checklist: water, hay, shelter. She'd done everything right, but something was wrong inside Whisper that no amount of care could fix. She grabbed her phone, hands shaking, and dialed the vet. The line rang and rang before Dr. Field's sleepy voice answered. "It's Whisper. He's burning up," Grace gasped. "I think it's pneumonia. Please, I need you." "I'll be there in an hour," Dr. Field promised. Grace hung up and got to work. She threw extra blankets over Whisper's back, filled his bucket with warm water, and knelt beside him in the straw. She read to him, anything she could find, old storybooks, family letters, her voice trembling but steady. She sang lullabies she hadn't sung since Ellie was alive, her words weaving through the cold air like a fragile prayer. Ella arrived at dawn, bundled in her father's old jacket, her eyes wide with fear. "How bad?" she asked, voice breaking. Grace's answer was a whisper. "I don't know. He's so strong, Ella. But this—" Her words caught. "I'm scared." They sat together in the stall, their breath rising in puffs of steam. Whisper struggled for every breath, his coat damp with sweat despite the chill. The hours crawled. Dr. Field finally arrived, his face grave as he listened to Whisper's chest, checked his gums, took his temperature. "He's a fighter," the vet said softly, "but he's very sick. I'll give him antibiotics, fluids, but it's up to him now." Grace nodded, blinking back tears. "He survived everything else. Please, please, Whisper, don't leave me." Word spread quickly in their small town. By midday, neighbors began to appear, some with casseroles, others with extra hay or home remedies. A few offered prayers, standing awkwardly in the barn aisle, hats in hand. Others came only to watch, their eyes full of doubt. Mrs. Lang from the next farm over lingered at the stall door. "Why risk so much for a broken-down horse?" she asked gently. Grace stood, her back straight, her voice unwavering. "Because he's not broken. Not really. He's just waiting for someone to believe he can heal." Some nodded, moved by her faith. Others whispered, casting sideways glances at the woman who still talked to ghosts. But Grace didn't care. Whisper needed her, and that was all that mattered. Night fell early, heavy with silence and the threat of more snow. Grace refused to leave the barn. She read aloud every story she could remember, her voice hoarse, her body aching. She told Whisper about Ellie's dreams, about Thomas's laughter, about all the things she was afraid to say to anyone else. Ella brought her coffee, wrapped her in a blanket, but Grace wouldn't sleep. "If he can fight, so can I," she insisted. The hours stretched on. Sometimes Grace drifted between waking and sleep, startled by Whisper's labored breathing or the distant howl of the wind. She dreamed of Ellie standing in the barn, her hair wild, her eyes shining. "Don't give up, Mama," Ellie whispered. "He came home for you." Grace awoke with a start, heart pounding. She pressed her forehead to Whisper's neck, willing her strength into him. "You're not alone," she murmured. "I'm here. I'm not giving up." At sunrise, Whisper's breathing eased. His eyes flickered open, meeting Grace's with something like recognition. He nuzzled her hand, his strength returning by the smallest measure. Ella found Grace slumped against the stall, tears streaming down her face. Not of fear, but of exhausted relief. "He's going to make it," Ella breathed, her own tears falling. Word spread just as quickly. Grace Harper's horse had survived the night. The community buzzed, some marveling at the miracle, others insisting it was just luck. But Grace knew the truth. Whisper's survival was more than luck. It was a promise kept, a bond stronger than loss or fear. For Grace, those long, sleepless nights changed something fundamental inside her. She'd faced her worst fears. not just losing Whisper, but losing hope. And by refusing to run, by standing vigil through the storm, she realized healing was not about erasing pain, but about loving fiercely through it. As she finally drifted to sleep beside Whisper, barn quiet in the pale morning light, Grace understood. If Whisper could survive, after all he'd endured, so could she. The news of Whisper's recovery spread through Coldwater County like sunlight breaking through a long, gray winter. Neighbors who once kept their distance now found reasons to walk by Grace's barn, curious about the miracle horse that had survived against all odds. Some came out of genuine care, others out of skepticism, but everyone seemed drawn by the quiet hope radiating from the old barn at the edge of Harperland. The days grew longer, the air tinged with the first hints of spring. Whisper's energy returned slowly at first, each day a little stronger. He nickered in greeting when Grace approached, nosed her pockets for apples, and allowed children to pet his neck through the fence. His coat gleamed in the sunlight, and even the scar on his shoulder looked less like a wound, more like a badge of courage. It was during one of these golden afternoons that Grace had an idea, one that took root almost without her realizing it. A group of children lingered at the fence, hesitant but hopeful, watching Whisper with wide, hungry eyes. One boy wore a faded cast on his arm. A little girl kept her distance, clutching a worn teddy bear, her mother hovering behind her. Grace set down her feed bucket and walked over, smiling. "Would you like to meet him up close?" she asked gently. The children looked at each other, unsure, but Grace's warmth drew them in. She opened the gate, knelt in the soft grass, and invited them forward. "He's gentle," she said, "but he's been through a lot. Sometimes he gets scared, just like people do." The girl with the teddy bear inched forward first, her eyes fixed on Whisper's scar. Grace took her hand, guiding it to the horse's soft nose. Whisper stood perfectly still, his ears flicking forward, a model of patience and trust. The other children followed, shy smiles blooming as they stroked his neck and watched him nibble treats from their palms. Parents gathered at the fence, relief and gratitude in their faces. Grace's heart swelled. For the first time in years, her barn was filled with laughter, not the echo of old memories, but the music of hope returning. Word traveled quickly. By the following week, children and parents were coming by every afternoon. Grace, with Ella's encouragement, opened the barn for what she called healing afternoons. She hung a chalkboard sign on the fence. "Come visit Whisper, all are welcome." She told stories about Whisper's journey, about courage and loss, about finding hope when you least expect it. At first, only a handful of families came, but as word spread, more joined in. Children who had lost a parent, families new to the area, even a few teenagers who pretended indifference, but lingered long after the younger kids left. Grace never pressed anyone to talk, but somehow Whisper's gentle presence did what words could not. The horse listened. He nudged hands, stood quietly while children cried into his mane, and even let a few lean against his side as if absorbing their pain. Ella began to help more, organizing games and quiet spaces where kids could draw or simply sit and listen to the barn's soft rhythms. "It's like he knows," Ella remarked one afternoon, watching Whisper lower his head to a boy who hadn't spoken since his father died. "He doesn't judge. He just accepts them." Grace nodded, wiping away a tear she didn't try to hide. Maybe that's what we all need. Just someone to see us, broken pieces and all, and not turn away. The town's view of Grace and her barn began to change. People who once whispered about that poor woman who lost everything now praised her strength and kindness. Some brought donations, bags of oats, bales of hay, even a new saddle. Others volunteered to help repair fences or muck stalls, grateful for a sense of purpose. One afternoon, Reverend Foster stopped by, a broad smile on his weathered face. "You've given this town something to believe in, Grace," he told her. "Not just the miracle of a horse surviving, but the miracle of hearts healing, one by one." Grace felt herself growing in confidence. She began to share her own story more openly, her grief, her guilt, her journey back to hope. She talked about Ellie, about Thomas, about the letter that changed everything. Parents nodded in understanding, some reaching for her hand, others simply grateful to have a place to lay down their burdens for a while. As Whisper continued to heal, so did Grace. She found herself humming again as she worked, laughing at Ella's jokes, lingering in the barn long after the last visitor left. Sometimes, as dusk fell, she'd stand with Whisper beneath the wide Tennessee sky, watching the first stars blink into existence, and feel Ellie's spirit there with her, bright, steady, unbroken. The barn, once a place of sorrow, became a sanctuary. Not just for Grace, but for everyone who crossed its threshold. Children painted pictures of Whisper to hang on the walls. Adults left notes of thanks, stories of loss and hope scribbled in shaky handwriting. There were tears, but also healing, gentle, slow, and real. Grace understood now what Thomas had meant. To bring hope home was to let it grow, to share it, to make it a promise not just to yourself, but to the whole world. Whisper, in all his broken beauty, had become a living reminder that no one is ever truly lost, not as long as someone is willing to open their heart. And for the first time in many years, as she watched children run laughing through the golden dusk, Grace felt that maybe, just maybe, she was exactly where she was meant to be. Late March brought the first warm breeze through the valley, coaxing wild violets from the ground and scattering petals across the pasture. The barn doors stood open to let the sunlight in, filling the old wooden space with golden light. For Grace, these mornings felt like miracles, a world she once thought she'd lost, slowly coming back into focus. One Saturday, she stood at the fence with Ella and a small group of children from the neighborhood. The air buzzed with the laughter and shouts of kids chasing each other around the barn, but Grace's mind was elsewhere, turning over the lessons of the last months. Whisper grazed nearby, as always a quiet anchor to her thoughts. Ella, noticing Grace's distant look, nudged her gently. "You've changed," she said softly. "We both have." Grace nodded, still watching the children. "I didn't think I'd ever find my way back. Not after everything." She let the words hang in the air, the pain in them softened by time. Ella placed a comforting hand on her arm. "You did more than find your way back, Grace. You led others with you. This whole town is different now." A few feet away, a little boy approached. His face streaked with dirt and worry. He stopped beside Grace, glancing shyly up at her, then at Whisper. "Miss Harper," he said, voice barely above a whisper. "Do you think Whisper's scared of his scar?" Grace knelt so she was eye level with the boy, searching for the right words. "I think Whisper remembers what hurt him," she replied. "But I don't think he's ashamed. His scar just means he's survived. It's part of his story." The boy nodded, tracing his fingers along the fence rail. "My daddy says you should forget bad things, but I can't. not even when I want to. Grace's heart ached for him. "It's okay to remember," she said. "Sometimes remembering is how we heal, and sometimes the best way to move forward is to forgive ourselves and the people who hurt us." Ella smiled, adding, "And it's okay to ask for help when you're hurting. You don't have to do it alone." A group of older kids joined them, one with a guitar slung across his back. He plucked a soft tune, and soon everyone was gathered in the grass, Whisper grazing at the edge, the adults leaning on the fence and listening. Grace took a deep breath, feeling the old urge to hide her pain rise up, but she pushed through. "You know, there was a time when I thought being strong meant keeping everything inside," she began, her voice trembling but honest. "I thought I had to outrun my sadness, pretend nothing hurt. But Whisper taught me something different." She glanced around, meeting the eyes of the children and parents, of Ella, and finally Whisper, who flicked an ear in her direction. Real strength is facing the pain, not fleeing from it. It's showing up day after day, even when it's hard. Loyalty, forgiveness, and compassion, those are the things that bring us back to life, even when we feel broken. A hush fell over the group, as if the barn itself was listening. The boy with the scarred arm pressed closer to Whisper, resting his head against the horse's warm side. Grace smiled, feeling the circle of trust they'd built together. After a while, Ella broke the silence. "Do you remember what Mama used to say? That a promise kept is more powerful than any apology?" Grace laughed quietly, the memory sweet and sad all at once. She was right. I made a promise to Whisper and to myself. I kept it even when it was hard. And I think that's why we're all here now. One of the mothers stepped forward, her voice thick with emotion. "You saved more than a horse, Grace. You gave all of us a place to start over. You helped us remember how to hope." Grace shook her head gently. "Whisper saved me. Maybe we saved each other. But the truth is, anyone can do what we did. You just have to believe it's possible, even when you can't see the way forward." As the afternoon faded, Grace and Ella sat on the porch while children drew chalk pictures on the barn doors. The quiet between them was full of understanding. They talked about forgiveness, the hardest kind, the kind you give yourself after years of carrying blame. Grace admitted the guilt she'd held, the fear that moving on meant betraying the memory of those she'd lost. Ella squeezed her hand. "Letting yourself heal doesn't mean forgetting. It means honoring the love you had and using it to build something new." Grace nodded, tears in her eyes. "I'm learning. Every day." As dusk painted the sky in pink and lavender, Grace watched the children gather around Whisper, their laughter ringing like music across the field. She realized her heart no longer ached in the same old way. The pain was there, but so was gratitude, and even, miraculously, joy. That night, Grace wrote in her journal for the first time in years. She wrote about loyalty and redemption and the small, stubborn hope that had survived inside her, even in the darkest times. She wrote about Ellie, about Thomas, about Whisper and Ella, and the families who had found their way to her barn, and as she finished, she wrote one final truth. "Saving Whisper allowed me to save myself." Maybe that's what hope really means. Believing that even when you're lost, you can be found again. The first morning of April broke clear and bright, sun spilling over dew-soaked fields and warming the world with a gentle golden promise. Grace stood at her kitchen window, coffee in hand, watching as Whisper grazed beneath the budding maples. The barn doors were flung wide, and the laughter of children already echoed across the yard. Everything felt fresh, alive, as if the land itself had been waiting for this moment. A new beginning. For the first time in years, Grace didn't wake to heaviness in her chest. Instead, there was lightness, anticipation. She opened her journal, flipping past pages once filled with sorrow, and found herself smiling at what she'd written the night before. What we dare to love, we never truly lose. Ella arrived early, her face flushed from the spring air, carrying a basket of warm muffins. "You ready for today?" she called. Grace grinned. "I think so. Feels like the start of something big." They had decided together that today would be more than just another healing afternoon. It would be a celebration, a way to thank the town that had become their extended family and honor the journey they'd all shared. Word had spread, and soon families gathered in the yard, arms laden with food, flowers, and old memories. Children painted colorful banners to hang on the barn. Parents set up picnic blankets beneath the trees. The old men from town tinkered with the fence, laughing as they worked. Even Dr. Field, the veterinarian, brought his family and winked at Grace as he handed her a lemon pie. "This is a first, you know," he teased. "A barn that heals more hearts than I ever could with a medicine bag." As the sun climbed higher, Grace and Ella led everyone to the pasture. Whisper stood at the gate, regal and calm, his once shabby coat now shining, the scar on his shoulder a quiet testament to everything he'd survived. Grace mounted up, swinging easily into the saddle, while Ella helped the youngest children climb onto the ponies the neighbors had brought for the day. With a whoop, the group set off across the open fields, children shrieking with delight, parents waving, the dogs barking in wild, joyful chaos. Whisper moved at an easy lope beneath Grace, his strength and gentleness a steady rhythm beneath her. Ella rode beside her on a borrowed mare, their laughter ringing out together for the first time in too long. At the far side of the field, they paused on a low ridge overlooking the valley. The view stretched wide, sunlight dancing on every blade of grass. Grace looked around at the families, the children, at Ella and Whisper, and felt a deep, profound gratitude. It was as if her heart had been returned to her, piece by piece, with every act of kindness, every shared sorrow and joy. She closed her eyes, letting the moment soak in, then turned to address the group, her voice clear and strong. "I used to think that when you lost someone, you lost them forever," she said, her eyes shining. "But I know now that's not true. What we dare to love, we never truly lose. Love lives on in memory, in the stories we share, and in the kindness we show each other." She smiled at Whisper, reaching down to stroke his neck. Forgiveness, of ourselves and of others, is the key to starting again. We can't change the past, but we can choose how we live with it. Even after devastating loss, new beginnings are always possible if we open our hearts. The children grew quiet, listening. Parents wiped away tears. Ella looped her arm around Grace's waist, squeezing her tight. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then, as if the world itself were sighing in relief, birdsong erupted from the trees. A sense of peace settled over the crowd. They rode back slowly, sunlight warming their backs. The barn in the distance now a beacon, no longer a place of sadness, but of hope. As they dismounted, Grace noticed Reverend Foster standing nearby, smiling. "This," he said, sweeping his arm at the joyful chaos, "is what community is all about. You've built something beautiful here, Grace." As the day wound down, families lingered beneath the trees, children sprawled on quilts, dogs sleeping in the grass. Grace and Ella sat on the porch steps, Whisper cropping grass at their feet. The sky blushed pink and gold as the sun began its slow descent. Ella nudged Grace. "Did you ever think we'd get here?" Grace shook her head, laughing softly. "Not in a million years. But I think Ellie and Tom would be proud. I think they're with us, in every bit of this." Ella rested her head on Grace's shoulder, and they watched the children chase fireflies as dusk fell. Grace felt a warmth deep inside, one that came from knowing she had not only survived, but had helped others find their own healing too. As night settled, the last families packed up to leave, hugging Grace and Ella, thanking them over and over. Whisper stood quietly by the gate, his gentle eyes reflecting the first stars overhead. Grace walked to him, pressing her forehead to his, feeling the peace in his steady breath. She thought of all they'd been through, the grief, the guilt, the endless nights of doubt, and knew she would carry those memories with her, but now as reminders of strength, not sorrow. In the quiet, she whispered, "Thank you for finding me when I was lost. Thank you for bringing me home." A gentle wind swept through the grass, the night alive with the promise of spring. Grace looked back at the barn, lit from within, echoing with laughter, and felt her heart settle in her chest, steady and sure. She knew there would still be hard days, moments of doubt, but she was no longer alone. She had her family, her friends, her community, and most of all, hope. A hope she would never let go of again. As the stars wheeled overhead, Grace, Whisper, Ella, and the children rode one last time through the fields, laughter trailing behind them, faith renewed with every hoofbeat and every breath of the cool night air. And in that perfect moment, Grace understood. Healing isn't about forgetting the past. It's about loving deeply, forgiving fully, and daring always to begin again.